So I've been seeing entities since I was a small child, but I didn't really know what to make of them or didn't even call them entities until I was much older and didn't know much about what they were about, right? I just had sensed that they were present and was really scared of them. And it's when I started working with people and giving psychic readings when I started to learn a lot about entities. And there's an aspect of entities that I think we really need to address. So when people first start learning that entities are a thing, it's really easy for them to start, number one, getting scared, and number two, starting to vilify the entities for everything. Like, oh, that's an entity is attacking me. The entities did this today, and like, yeah, it's true. Like all the evil in the world is perpetrated by entities, but that's not that big of a deal because this world needs evil. Like we're having a play, we're having a drama, right? There's good and evil, there's the hero and the enemy. I mean, it's just part of the makeup of this reality. So to me, it's very similar to like when you play football, there's like the white shirts and the red shirts, or the guys with shirts and the guys without shirts. It's just to have fun. It's not like the guys on the opposite side of the team are somehow like to be feared, you just need an opposition to have a game. That's all. And in many ways, you want your opposition to play their best, right? So when they play their best, you can play your best. I think we understand this on a sportsmanship level. This is no different. The sportsmanship here is really interesting. The game of this reality, in my opinion, is just to love yourself. And entities make it really difficult to love yourself sometimes. Anyway, so I won't go into like what entities are responsible for and this and that. More this idea that entities really serve you. So I remember one time I was giving a psychic reading to someone, and they had a very traumatic childhood where their dad was the kind of person who'd like turn over the dinner table if it wasn't set correctly. And just everyone was cowering in fear because, of course, he hit people, he was yelling, he was drunk a lot, he hit the wife. And in my opinion, the wife was just as complicit. Like, it's easy to be like, well, the dad was abusive and the wife was unfortunately abused by her husband. And then the children were abused by the man, and the wife just couldn't protect her children. Like, to me, what I see in ego and shadow is that she enjoyed this drama just as much. She enjoyed playing the victim, though. But both she and her husband were both abusing the children, because she really didn't like this. She would just take the children out of the situation, and she didn't. She kept raising them in that situation. She taught her children, like, shh, like, don't make dad angry, this kind of stuff. So she taught her children to be victims because she enjoyed being a victim herself. So I consider her to be just as complicit, if not in many cases more complicit than her own husband in abusing the children. Like, he's the fall guy. Like, he's obviously, dumb, stupid, evil, abusive, you could say, but that's the easy rule to take. She's the one who is more manipulative in her shadow. Her ego probably would be like, what? I didn't like being abused. He hit me too, right? That's your ego. Your ego loves being the victim. The shadow is what manipulates everything. And she chose him. And she chose him to have children with. And then after the first child, she had more children. I mean, she knew exactly what she was doing, some part of her. So to me, she was actually probably more abusive than him, in my opinion, based on what I see in ego and shadow. So anyway, this person grew up in this kind of environment where both of her parents abused her in very insidious ways, with her father being the more obvious looking abuser type. And if she stood up for herself and be like, Dad, you're not supposed to do that. We set the dinner table correctly and you're not supposed to do that, she'd be smacked, right? So in order to survive, I saw like this like floating around guilt entity just come up to her and like a puppy dog be like, I can help you. And she's really little. Usually when entities enter your system, you're really, really little. You're like 3 years old, pretty much. So unbeknownst to her, she just adopts this entity like a friend. And since this entity is guilt, it's guilt energy incarnate. When this friend lives in her system, this woman is pre-small, like oh my God, I'm so sorry, for no reason. And she learned that when she had this guilt for no reason around her father, he wouldn't hit her because he also had a guilt entity. He probably felt guilty for his out of control. And his guilt entity was eating all of the guilt of the whole family. So the whole family was guilty all the time. They also had shame, obviously, and anger and fear. They had everything. But in her particular case, guilt was very, very strong. The thing that guilt does, just so you know, is guilt is makes you serve outside of your boundaries. So it puts you in your masculine and you do things for others, for the benefit of others outside of your boundaries. This is different than shame. If you feel shame, you are also outside of your boundaries, but you're in a more feminine position where you're the victim, where someone's like, let's say, actively abusing you in some kind of way. Whereas guilt, to avoid the shame, avoid the victimization, you pre-give the energy. So you prefer to control someone and make them into your parasite. So guilt puts you in your masculine. Shame means you're in your feminine. And in order to avoid the shame, people usually prefer the guilt because they have some sort of sense of control, because at least they're in their masculine. And so this woman adopted a guilt entity when she was really, really young. And I could see that as she was growing up, because her mom taught her, like, if the dad overturns the dinner table, who cleans it up? Him? No, the mom and the kids clean up the dinner table like it's all their fault, right? Guilt, right? Guilt. So she grew up with this guilt entity that saved her from being smacked. This guilt entity was her friend. It was like an invisible friend. It's like an invisible dog that's loyal to you and loves you. And guilt entities, they're not that conscious, I mean, there's various kinds of entities, and some are very, very old, and they're like scary vampires, and they do high levels of black magic, and they just go from human to human to human, and it's like craziness, that exists. It exists. But in general, like this guilt entity, for example, it's not that conscious. It just is. It just exists, like mold spores in the air exist, and mold spores in the air help digest dead and decaying matter. So we need that, right? And in many ways, this guilt entity completely served its purpose in this ecosystem in the home. And so now this woman is in her 30s with a fucking strong guilt entity. It's been feeding off of her whole life. And she didn't really know, she didn't really know she had a guilt entity until I told her. And then, of course, when I told her, she started to feel it. And a lot of times in sessions with me, people start to feel their entities as separate from them for the first time ever. And so you're like, oh shit, that's not me, because she grew up with this guilt feeling her whole life. Like, she didn't know what it felt like to not feel guilt. So she just thought it was normal, right? So you can see how this guilt entity just kind of like hid behind her ego and served her ego being like, I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry, kind of thing. And what's really interesting is, depending on your nationality and how you were raised, there are certain cultures where certain entities are more prevalent. In certain cultures, drinking is more prevalent. So what kind of entities do you think that is? Anger and shame, by the way. In other cultures, like marijuana is really, really prevalent. So depending on how you grew up, the entity that's prevalent, it's just in the culture more, and that's just interesting. So anyway, in her case, guilt was really strong in her system. She didn't even know she had a guilt entity. And what I saw was, it was really hard for her to just like suddenly let go of this guilt entity in this one session, because it was a very loyal friend to her. And it was just so ingrained in her system that she didn't even know who she was without the guilt entity. Like, she had a child and she had a man in her life based on this guilt entity in her system, and how she operated was feeding this guilt entity. How she ran her business was feeding this guilt entity. She almost didn't even know who she was without this guilt entity. So you can see that it's not so easy to just be like, well, entities are bad. Entities are cause everything bad, and I just want to get rid of all my entities. When people first hear about entities and they know that I see entities, they often ask me, do I have entities? How many do I have? And they get real scared. It's like, dude, you probably have a lot of entities. I'm not going to lie. And that's normal. Most humans have a lot of entities. And that's what causes death and old age and disease and stupid thinking and you being in your mind and difficulty being in touch with your intuition and your abundance. Like it's just, it causes like, problems breathing at nighttime and stuff like this. If you have nightmares, probably because you have an entity in your system. Like entities are just very common. It's just that they're like sort of not that well known. So it can be kind of like a revelation when you hear about them. But once you get used to the idea and you get over your egotistical fear, it's not that big of a deal. Especially if you're capable of raising your vibration so you can actually handle your entities or get rid of all of them altogether, which is completely possible, which I think is everyone's path anyway. So this woman, it kind of smacked her quite hard to realize she had a guilt entity. She felt it during the session for the first time ever. And she had a lot of mixed feelings because the guilt entity was causing her to undercharge for her services. She's charging like 1/3 the price she really should. And she didn't feel confident charging her full rate, what she really should energetically charge, given the energy she's giving in a session, So she got used to just working 3 times as much. And as you can imagine, her ego was like, I'm proud of myself. I'm like a energizer bunny. I can work 3 times as much as other people, and I'm fine with my finances as a result. So you can see that her ego liked having this guilt entity. Her ego liked being this like weird savior type. Guilt often brings out this martyrdom. This overwork is overgiving at work, overgiving to others, overpromising kind of thing. This kind of person also tends to cancel at the last minute because they're sick all the time. This kind of person, is that you? And you like take like 10 days to answer a text message because you're just so tired. And you're always coming down with bronchitis and stuff. Anyway, so she had mixed feelings. And what I saw with this lady was she really had to sit with this because it's a big goodbye. You don't get rid of a guilt entity like this with hatred. You don't just go, I hate your entity, get away from me. It doesn't work like that. The guilt entity is such a big part of you. You have to really look at yourself. Does that make sense? You have to really look at yourself and figure out who you are without this guilt entity. And then you have to logically choose yourself over the entity, which most people cannot do. They choose the entity over themselves. They choose to feed the entity forever and they develop cancer and die. And they do black magic on their family members and feed their entity, their family members' life force energy, and their family members die early also. Do you have someone in your family who's really disempowered? Like just can't get their life together? Dead end job or no job, financially dependent upon other people. Maybe they're like in their 40s or their 50s, but might as well be emotionally 15 years old. Do you have someone like this in your family? Is that you? They are feeding someone's entity, someone more powerful in the family. They are feeding someone's entity in the family. So when you choose an entity over yourself, everyone suffers. It's not just you, it's everyone who in your life you touch. And if you have more power in the hierarchy than someone else, they're going to feed your entity too. So children often feed the entity of their parents. That disempowered person at home, probably feeding a parent. And entities are really woven into the fabric of our daily existence, and we don't really even realize. We just blame that person for being disempowered and blame that person for not being healed or for being lazy or whatever they are. Annoying. They're probably annoying also. So anyway, begging for money all the time. They probably have addictions and stuff too. So this woman had to really look at herself and find out who she is separate from her entity. Then she had to choose herself over her entity. So that's a big step. That's akin to just being an alcoholic, reaching rock bottom and deciding to recover and never going back to the drink. It's a big deal to choose yourself over your entity, because that will change all of your relationships, because that woman, like I said, she had a business, a partner, and a child, all based on feeding this entity. So all of those would have to shift if she wasn't going to feed her entity anymore, because everyone liked her being guilty. Everyone liked her overworking. Everyone liked her having a really, really low rate. Do you see? So can you face people not liking you anymore? A lot of people can't. And then she in particular had to do some kind of a goodbye ceremony, which I think is appropriate for almost anyone. Your entity was a loyal dog to you your whole life and kept you safe. but now you're an adult and you have to let it go and you can't feed it your life force energy anymore, which means it might die. So it's a very poignant moment. Because remember, even if the entity serves evil, like if you feed the entity for the rest of your life, you'll die early and you'll have disease and you'll have messed up relationships. But the entity itself is not like inherently bad, right? It's just doing what it's doing. A mold spore is not inherently bad. It's just a part of the fabric of life. It's the white shirt, red shirt situation. It's just the opposite end of, so you can just have something to work with. So remember, this game of life is just love yourself. And this entity is making it easy and hard to love yourself, right? Without this entity, you have nothing to work with. So to love yourself would be to choose yourself over this entity. To not love yourself is to choose the entity over yourself. Without this entity, you would have nothing to work with. There's no way to choose yourself without this entity. So this entity is not inherently bad. And a lot of people have to do something like this, I see. Some kind of goodbye ceremony that's very similar to the kinds of ceremonies I see women do when they have had abortions. Because again, that is a big deal. And there's a lot of mixed feelings, and there's a lot of asking for forgiveness and saying goodbye, and a lot of gratitude and this kind of thing. And a lot of feeling like, when you get rid of your entity, sometimes you feel bad because you're kind of dooming this being to death. So it's really interesting, in my opinion, self-mastery and maturity and all kinds of things. A lot of it has to do with handling evil. So can you end things with love? Can you end things with love? And if you can't end things with love, most likely you're going to have an attachment to this entity for the rest of your life. But can you end things with love and just recognize that the entity is done serving its purpose for you? A lot of you do not have the same best friend from when you're 5 years old. Some of you do, but a lot of you do not, because you're different now. You're 50 years old. So whoever you're best friends with when you're 5, maybe you stopped being best friends when you're 15. That makes sense. This entity should not be with you for the rest of your life just because it helped you survive trauma when you're really little. So the steps are to feel yourself separate from your entity, which is already a big deal. A lot of people don't even know what this feels like, to feel yourself separate from your entity and choose yourself over your entity. That is self-love. When you choose yourself over your entity, then you can have a goodbye ceremony with love. Will this in and of itself get rid of the entity? No, getting rid of entities is a lot of work. But without this goodbye ceremony, a lot of people don't feel complete. And what this goodbye ceremony highlights for me is gratitude. Gratitude to this entity for serving its purpose. It's like having gratitude for the opposite team. It doesn't matter who won the football game. You guys had a game. And thank you for playing your hardest so I could play my hardest. Thank you for having this game. I don't understand why you'd want to live without having gratitude. It doesn't even make any sense to me. So having a lot of gratitude for your entities, how much they served you, they kept you safe up until now, makes a lot of sense to me. And I think when people get stuck in this, oh my God, I'm scared of my entities. Oh my God, my entity did this, vilifying the entity, you're not taking responsibility for your entities being your best friend and helping you. And that's not mature. So I wanted to talk about that today. Thank you for listening. See you next time. Bye.